The International Affairs Forum at Georgetown University was buzzing with anticipation. Red velvet curtains framed the mahogany stage as attendees settled into their plush seats, programs rustling softly against the backdrop of hushed conversations. This wasn't just any policy discussion. It was the annual Global Perspectives debate, where America's most influential political minds gathered to discuss the nation's role on the world stage. The air conditioning hummed a bit too strongly, sending an occasional shiver through the crowd as the scent of coffee and expensive cologne mingled in the air. Camera crews jostled for position along the perimeter, their equipment cases stacked like miniature skyscrapers against the wall. The moderator, Dr. Eleanor Winters, a silver-haired veteran of diplomatic journalism with piercing blue eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they saw, tapped her microphone gently. "Testing. 1, 2, she murmured, her voice betraying none of the tension evident in her tight grip on her note cards. If you're enjoying this story so far, please consider subscribing to our channel. We bring you these in-depth political analyses every week. Also, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love connecting with our audience worldwide." In the green room, Vice President J.D. Vance adjusted his tie, the silky material cool against his fingertips. Unlike the 5 other panelists who were frantically reviewing their notes or checking their hair in the mirror, Vance stood perfectly still, his eyes focused on a distant point as if seeing something beyond the tastefully decorated walls. A career military man before entering politics, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced actual life-and-death situations, rather than just political ones. 2 minutes, Mr. Vice President, a young aide called, her voice slightly higher than normal. Everyone knew what was at stake tonight. What the audience didn't know, what even Vance himself didn't fully realize, was that Dr. Winters had spent the past 3 weeks crafting a question designed specifically to undermine him. A question that, according to the 4 political strategists she had consulted, had no satisfactory answer. A question that would expose what she and her colleagues at the Atlantic Policy Institute believed was Vance's fundamental weakness on foreign affairs. The stage lights cast a golden glow across the polished wood floor as the panelists took their seats. From left to right, Senator James Harrison, former Secretary of State Victoria Palmer, Middle East expert Dr. Khalid Rahman, Vice President J.D. Vance, Russian Affairs Specialist Dr. Natalia Orlova, and former UN Ambassador Thomas Chen. An impressive lineup by any standard, but all eyes were drawn to Vance, his presence somehow both relaxed and commanding. For the first 40 minutes, the discussion proceeded predictably. Trade policies, climate accords, and defense spending each got their due as the panelists exchanged well-rehearsed talking points. Dr. Winters moderated with professional detachment, occasionally steering the conversation back when it veered off course, but otherwise allowing the experts to engage directly. The audience responded with appropriate nods and polite applause, but there was nothing remarkable, not yet. "Let's turn our attention to emerging conflicts," Dr. Winters finally said, her tone shifting almost imperceptibly. Those paying close attention might have noticed how she straightened slightly, how her gaze fixed more intently on her target. "Vice President Vance, your administration has taken what some call a selective engagement approach to global conflicts. Critics suggest this represents a retreat from America's moral responsibility as a superpower." She paused, letting the silence build just long enough to be uncomfortable before continuing. "How do you justify intervening in some humanitarian crises while ignoring others that appear objectively worse? Specifically, your passionate advocacy for Christian minorities in the Middle East while remaining relatively silent on the Rohingya genocide. Isn't this simply religious favoritism guiding America's moral compass?" The question hung in the air like a thundercloud. A murmur rippled through the audience. This was no softball question. This was a carefully crafted trap. Respond with too much religious emphasis, and he'd be branded a zealot. Distance himself from religious concerns, and he'd lose his base. Try to walk the middle ground, and he'd appear weak and indecisive. Former Secretary Palmer smiled faintly behind her water glass. She knew a political execution when she saw one. Senator Harrison shifted uncomfortably, suddenly finding his notepad fascinating. Even Dr. Rahman, often critical of American foreign policy, appeared surprised by the nakedly partisan framing. The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees as all eyes turned to Vance. For exactly 3 seconds, a lifetime in political discourse, he did not respond. The silence was so complete, you could hear the soft click of cameras documenting what many expected to be a defining moment of weakness. Then Vance smiled. Not the defensive smile of a politician buying time, but the genuine smile of someone who recognized the game being played and refused to accept its rules. "That's a fascinating question, Doctor. Winters," he began, his voice warm but firm, carrying to every corner of the room without seeming to rise. "And I appreciate the opportunity to address it directly." He leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped loosely on the table. "Before I answer, I'd like to challenge the premise itself. You've framed American foreign policy as a binary choice between religious favoritism and moral abdication. But that framework misses something fundamental about how nations must operate in the real world." Dr. Winters blinked rapidly. This wasn't the defensive response she had anticipated. "America has always balanced three factors in our foreign policy decisions: our values, our interests, and our capabilities," Vance continued. "Pretending we can or should intervene in every humanitarian crisis, regardless of our strategic interests or practical capabilities, isn't moral leadership. It's moral posturing." A few audience members nodded, perhaps surprised to find themselves agreeing. "As for the specific comparison you've drawn," he said, "let me ask you this. When was the last time you heard any major news outlet provide in-depth coverage of the Rohingya crisis? When was the last congressional hearing devoted specifically to it?" Dr. Winters opened her mouth to respond, but Vance continued with respectful but undeniable momentum. "The truth is, America can't solve every problem or heal every wound in the world. What we can do is be honest about our priorities and capabilities and make the most meaningful impact where we're best positioned to do so." His voice took on a more personal tone, and the audience leaned forward involuntarily. "When I was serving in Iraq, I learned something crucial about effective intervention. Local knowledge and genuine understanding of cultural context matter more than abstract principles applied from thousands of miles away. Our interventions in regions where we have deeper historical ties, stronger diplomatic relationships, and better intelligence networks are simply more likely to succeed." Dr. Rahman was now watching Vance with undisguised interest, his earlier skepticism giving way to something like reluctant respect. "This isn't about religious favoritism," Vance said, his eyes now meeting Dr. Winters directly. "It's about effectiveness. It's about recognizing that America's moral authority in the world isn't measured by how many conflicts we involve ourselves in, but by whether our involvement actually improves lives and promotes stability." The room was absolutely silent now. Even the camera operators had stopped fidgeting with their equipment. "And let me address something else that I think underlies your question," Vance continued, his tone measured but resolute. "There seems to be a strange double standard in our political discourse where showing concern for persecuted Christians is somehow suspect, while advocacy for other groups is considered virtuous. Both deserve our attention. Both deserve our compassion." Dr. Winters shifted in her seat, her carefully constructed trap disintegrating before her eyes. "I reject the notion that America must choose between our values and our interests," Vance said, his voice gaining strength without losing its composure. "The most successful foreign policy recognizes that in the long run, they are one and the same. A world of stable, prosperous democracies is both morally preferable and strategically beneficial." Ambassador Chen was now nodding openly, perhaps recognizing in Vance's words the pragmatic idealism that had guided America's most successful diplomatic efforts. "So yes, our administration has prioritized certain interventions over others. We've been transparent about those choices. We've justified them based on where American influence can be most effective, not based on religious favoritism. And I would challenge anyone who suggests otherwise to examine their own assumptions about when American intervention is appropriate and when it isn't." Dr. Winters realized too late that her gotcha question had transformed into a platform for Vance to demonstrate exactly the thoughtful, nuanced understanding of foreign policy that she had hoped to prove he lacked. But she wasn't finished yet. Vice President, she interjected, a new edge in her voice. That sounds reasonable in theory, but in practice, your administration has consistently— If I may, Vance interrupted gently but firmly, I think the American people are tired of hearing what sounds reasonable in theory, but doesn't work in practice. They've had enough of foreign policy decisions made to impress the diplomatic cocktail circuit rather than to actually improve lives. A spontaneous burst of applause erupted from the audience. Dr. Winter's face flushed as she realized she was losing control of her own forum. The truth is, Vance continued once the applause subsided, for too long our foreign policy establishment has confused activity with achievement. They measure success by how many countries we intervene in, how many treaties we sign, how many resolutions we pass, rather than by actual outcomes for real people. Senator Harrison was now watching Vance with undisguised admiration, political differences momentarily set aside in recognition of a masterful performance. What the American people want, what people everywhere want, isn't American involvement in every conflict. It's American leadership that is clear-eyed, consistent, and grounded in both moral principles and practical realities. Dr. Winters attempted to regain control. But surely, Vice President, you can't deny that religious considerations— Vance raised his hand slightly, a small gesture that somehow commanded the room's attention. Dr. Winters, with respect, I think you're still missing my point, he said, his tone firm but not unkind. This isn't about religion versus secular humanitarianism. It's about effectiveness versus symbolism. It's about recognizing that America's resources and influence, while considerable, are not unlimited. He leaned forward, his gaze intensifying. Let me ask you a direct question. Do you believe the United States should commit military resources to every humanitarian crisis around the globe, regardless of our strategic interests or chance of success? The audience held its breath. Dr. Winters hesitated, suddenly finding herself in the very trap she had set for another. Of course not, she finally conceded. That would be impractical and potentially counterproductive. Then we agree on the principle, Vance replied with a smile. The question isn't whether we should be selective in our engagements. It's what criteria we should use for that selection. And I submit that effectiveness, not ideology, should be our guiding star. Dr. Orlova, the Russian specialist who had remained silent throughout this exchange, suddenly spoke up. Vice President, if I may, your perspective seems to echo the realist school of international relations, yet you clearly maintain a moral dimension to your thinking. How do you reconcile these traditionally opposing viewpoints? It was a genuine question rather than a gotcha attempt, and Vance responded in kind. That's an excellent question, Dr. Orlova. The dichotomy between realism and idealism in foreign policy has always struck me as a false choice. The most effective American foreign policy combines both. His expression grew contemplative, and the audience sensed they were seeing not just a polished political performance, but a genuine window into his thinking. When I was a young Marine in Iraq, I saw firsthand how policy decisions made thousands of miles away affected real lives on the ground. I saw well-intentioned idealistic policies fail because they ignored local realities. And I saw coldly realistic policies fail because they generated such resentment that they were unsustainable. The personal anecdote landed with impact, reminding everyone that Vance wasn't just another politician theorizing about conflicts from the safety of Washington. America at its best operates with what I call pragmatic idealism, a clear-eyed recognition of the world as it is, combined with a commitment to moving it closer to what it should be. Not through grandiose gestures or symbolic interventions, but through patient, consistent leadership, guided by both moral principles and practical judgment. Dr. Rahman, initially the most skeptical panelist, now joined the conversation. But Vice President, how do you respond to those who see America's selective interventions as simply advancing American interests under the guise of moral concern? I'd say they're half right, Vance replied with disarming candor. American foreign policy should advance American interests. I make no apology for that. The mistake is in assuming that our moral concerns and our national interests are somehow separate or opposed. He gestured inclusively to the panel and audience. America's fundamental interest is in a stable, prosperous world where human rights are respected and conflicts are resolved peacefully. That's not just our moral preference. It's our strategic interest. When we advocate for religious freedom, whether for Christians, Muslims, Jews, Buddhists, or any faith, we're advancing both our values and our interests in global stability. Former Secretary Palmer, until now content to watch Vance navigate these challenging waters, decided to press him further. With respect, Vice President, that sounds like having your cake and eating it too. Sometimes our values and interests come into direct conflict. What then? Vance nodded, acknowledging the challenge. You're absolutely right, Madam Secretary. Those difficult cases are where leadership is truly tested. In those moments, we must be guided by our constitutional principles and our strategic priorities. His voice took on a more somber tone. But we should never pretend that refusal to act is somehow morally neutral. Sometimes the cost of action is too high, but we should be honest about the cost of inaction as well. Neither is without moral consequence. The audience had fallen completely silent, many scribbling notes or recording on their phones. This wasn't the political theater they had expected. It was something far more substantive. Dr. Winters, recognizing that her attempt to corner Vance had instead provided him with a platform to demonstrate depth and nuance, tried one final approach. Vice President, these are certainly eloquent words, but critics would say your administration's actions tell a different story. Just last month, your State Department declined to condemn human rights abuses in countries where we have significant economic interests. It was a broad accusation, difficult to refute without specific examples. Exactly the kind of rhetorical maneuver political journalists often use to force defensive responses. But Vance didn't take the bait. You know, Dr. Winters, he said with a thoughtful expression, one of the challenges of political discourse today is the tendency to deal in sweeping generalizations rather than specific facts. Several audience members nodded in recognition of this common frustration. If there are specific situations where you believe we've failed to uphold our values, I'm happy to discuss them directly. But I won't accept the premise that selective engagement means moral compromise. He turned slightly to address the audience more directly. The American people deserve better than foreign policy by Twitter hashtag. They deserve leaders who make difficult choices based on substantive analysis rather than symbolic gestures that make us feel good but accomplish little. Another round of spontaneous applause broke out, louder than before. Dr. Winters glanced at her producer, who was watching with a mixture of concern and fascination from the wings. The reality, Vance continued once the applause subsided, is that sometimes quiet diplomacy accomplishes more than public condemnation. Sometimes economic engagement creates more leverage for human rights than economic isolation. And sometimes, yes, we must make painful prioritizations based on where American influence can make the greatest difference. His voice took on a quality rarely heard in political discourse, genuine conviction without self-righteousness. What I can promise the American people is this: we will never value economic interests above fundamental human rights. But we will be strategic and clear-eyed about how we advance those rights in a complex world. And we will judge our success not by how many statements we issue or resolutions we pass, but by actual improvements in human freedom and dignity around the world. The audience rose in a standing ovation, surprising even themselves with the spontaneous show of support. Dr. Winters sat motionless, her carefully planned exposé thoroughly transformed by a display of thoughtful leadership that transcended partisan politics. As the applause continued, Senator Harrison leaned over to Ambassador Chen. "I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like that," he whispered, genuine admiration in his voice despite their policy differences. Ambassador Chen nodded. "That wasn't politics," he replied. "That was statesmanship." The remaining 40 minutes of the forum passed in substantive discussion, with Vance continuing to engage thoughtfully with his fellow panelists. But everyone present knew they had witnessed something rare, a moment when political theater gave way to authentic leadership, when talking points surrendered to conviction, and when a gotcha question became an opportunity for genuine understanding. As Vance left the stage following a second standing ovation, a young policy student approached him. "Sir," she said, her voice slightly nervous, "I came here tonight strongly disagreeing with your administration's approach. I just wanted to say, I still don't agree with everything, but you've given me a lot to think about." Vance smiled, more gratified by this honest response than by all the applause. "That's the highest compliment you could pay me," he replied. "Thinking deeply about these issues is the first step toward finding better solutions together." Meanwhile, in the control room, the producer turned to Dr. Winters, who was gathering her notes with uncharacteristic awkwardness. "Well," he said quietly, "that didn't go as planned." Dr. Winters was silent for a moment, then surprised him with a thoughtful response. "Maybe that's the problem," she said slowly. "Maybe too much of what we do is planned to fit narratives rather than discover truth." As video clips of Vance's response spread across social media, garnering millions of views within hours, Americans across the political spectrum found themselves engaged in more nuanced conversations about foreign policy than had occurred in years. Political analysts who had gathered to dissect what they expected to be a campaign-ending gaffe instead found themselves discussing substantive questions about America's role in the world. And though few would admit it publicly, many of these analysts, even those ideologically opposed to Vance, found themselves privately agreeing with Ambassador Chen's assessment. What they had witnessed wasn't politics as usual, it was leadership. And in a world starved for authentic leadership, that might be the most powerful message of all. If you found value in this analysis of leadership and foreign policy, please like and subscribe for more insightful political commentary. Remember, true leadership transcends party lines. It's about character, conviction, and the courage to speak truth even when it doesn't fit neatly into partisan narratives. God bless America, and may we always strive to be worthy of the incredible privilege of citizenship in this great nation.